Hi, I think we'll kick things off. Hopefully a few more people might join, but we'll get cracking. So welcome to our first open lecture this year in 2021. We are Sheffield School of Architecture Students for Climate Action, a student-led group from the School of Architecture campaigning for a greater emphasis on sustainability and architectural education. We're delighted to be joined by CAUKIN Studio tonight. CAUKIN Studio is a social enterprise that creates impact through architecture. They use their projects as a vehicle to educate and upskill local communities and international participants in design and construction. Since 2020, they've been running online workshops corresponding with physical built projects, delving into design and alternative ways of practicing architecture.
In tonight's lecture, CAUKIN will be talking about their response to the increasing frequency of strong cyclones in the South Pacific due to climate change. They're aiming to create a design handbook of principles for cyclone-resistant building so that buildings have a better chance of surviving future cyclones.
Awesome. I guess we'll take
Before we begin, we've just got a few housekeeping rules. Just while CAUKIN are talking, if everyone could mute their microphones and turn off their video, that'd be fab. And there'll be some time at the end of the session to ask any questions you might have, which will be done through the chat box. Before we begin, we will be recording this session for you to watch back in your own time or if anyone's missed it. But for now, CAUKIN, take it away.
Okay, cool. I think the first slide is are we recording? Is that all good? We can go? Cool.
Yeah, we've got it. Thanks.
Awesome. Yeah, so thanks for that introduction. We're going to talk about kind of our practice as a whole and then focus a bit more on some of the projects that we've done, especially, as Sophia said, relating to kind of the cyclone design and some of the work we've done in the South Pacific. I think an issue that's becoming more and more important, especially as climate change is kind of increasing the frequency of natural disasters, and that's been already shown this year in 2020 when the South Pacific's been hit by 2 Category 5 cyclones. So it's a really serious issue that is becoming more and more prominent. So yes, we're CAUKIN. We are a design and build practice, and we've been kind of building and working on community projects for the last 6 years now. So the name comes from the origins of our founders, which are Canada, the UK, and Indonesia. And as the introduction said, we're a social enterprise that use design and build projects as a vehicle to create a social, environmental, and economic impact. Now, as I say, we've been doing this for the last 6 years, and over time it's kind of developed, and I suppose this is our kind of ethos or mission statement, if you like, our approach to design and our approach to how we tackle projects. So that's democratic education, quality design, accessible to all. So we believe that everyone should have the opportunity and tools to shape the spaces that they inhabit and that are around them, and that we should all benefit from the quality of life that's achieved through informed design. Then finally, a really important one, construction has to reduce its environmental impact on our planet. So that's our kind of mission or ethos, and we try to achieve that through our kind of 3 main pillars. So the first of which is designing through collaboration. So by that we mean working with the local communities, a whole group of stakeholders on every project from the very onset of a project. So whether that is creating a brief or being approached by a community or an NGO with a brief, right through all of the design phases, and then completing the construction on site, and then even as far as kind of reevaluating and conducting post-occupancy surveys so that we can really understand how the building's being used and how it's been adapted, and therefore improve our future buildings. And we think that that's really key as well to gaining proper end user engagement and stakeholder engagement throughout the whole project. So then the second one is learn through building. So as I said before, half of the work we do is building. So we're not just designing these spaces, we're getting on site and building them as well. So that's getting as many local people involved as possible, as well as international students and participants like you guys from universities all over the world, design students, architecture, engineering, that sort of thing, to get that hands-on education and to learn from local people about local construction methods. But part of that is also working with unskilled local people to train them in construction and design methodologies, and then hopefully increase their opportunity for future employment. The final one then is experience through immersion. So often on almost all of our projects, we are living and working alongside the community members. So, you know, not only getting stuck in with things on site, but it's also getting involved in, you know, chores off site, cooking, cleaning, washing up, you know, really trying to get ingrained in the local culture as much as possible. And that helps us to kind of really gain a much deeper understanding of local ways of life and local culture, but also helps to achieve an even greater ownership over the projects by the community that we're working with too. And I think often a lot of the international participants that have worked on our projects have said that this is definitely one of the most valuable parts of working on these kind of builds. So it all started back in 2015 when we were studying towards our second year of architecture. We were kind of, I suppose, young, naive architecture students, but we wanted to somehow put our education into some sort of practical use. I mean, a lot of our kind of friends and colleagues and peers at the time were starting to do work experience in you know, architecture offices or that sort of thing. But we felt that we wanted to apply our knowledge in a bit more of a practical way. So we set about by contacting charities and NGOs all over the world, kind of, you know, saying, look, we're a group of enthusiastic architecture students. We've got a limited design and build knowledge, but we'd like to kind of design and build something for you that might help you further your mission or help to create a larger impact through what you're doing. So we were really lucky that we came across a charity called the Friends of Co-Wrong. They just set up a charity on the island to give to the local kids an education, to set up a school there, but also to give them a bit of a safe haven and a place to go away from some of the kind of negative impacts that tourism was starting to bring to the small island. So they said, yeah, I mean, we'd love it if you could build us, you know, a playground or an outdoor learning space, somewhere that the kids can kind of be safe but explore creative play. So we set about designing this, which was the Playscape, our kind of first project, working with the community and the school kids to come up with design ideas, and then obviously getting out there for, I think it was about 6 to 7 weeks on site to construct this building, or this playground rather. And I think we were maybe naive in our ambition. You know, we thought we were going to have a nice time and we could work with some local people and, you know, it would be a nice outcome when we build this playground. But I don't think we realized quite how much the whole experience was going to impact us. Both, you know, learning to work with local people, learning about the kind of knowledge they have, the, you know, ingrained knowledge they have of construction and local materials, and really, you know, learning a lot from that as architecture students and being able to kind of apply some of those ideas into then our future designs, but also being able to kind of teach some simple design principles to some of the local people so that, you know, hopefully in future that they can kind of improve the spaces that they're building themselves. So this was something we just felt we had to keep doing more of, and keep progressing and pushing our projects as much as possible.
So after that first project, we kind of realized that we wouldn't be able to keep running them in the same way. So that first project was funded through a Kickstarter campaign, and we'd kind of exhausted all of our friends, family, relatives, etc., and it wasn't going to be a sustainable model. So as we progressed as students, we wanted to maintain our practice and keep doing these projects, and we identified 6 key stakeholders that would be crucial to the success of a project. So the first of which is the local community, as Josh said earlier, making sure they're fully involved right through the entire process, brief making, designing, construction, etc., making sure that they have that full ownership of the project. We've then got the Ngo and Charity Partner. So on each of our projects, we will work with a local figurehead or a local charity that already has that trust of the community. They have the local knowledge of logistics, of local customs, and where the needs are as well. So they're responsible for identifying which projects would be the most beneficial and also fundraising towards the build cost. We've then got the international participants, so you guys, students from around the world who are coming to impart their own experience and their own knowledge, but equally learn from the local community, skills in construction, etc., and working in different climates and contexts. This leads directly on to the local skilled workers. So on each project, we'll work with the NGO to identify a few key people within the community or surrounding area that have necessary skills in bricklaying or carpentry, and their sort of role is to educate us, the participants, younger members of the community, making sure that everybody's upskilling and increasing their employability. Then there's the sponsors and donors, who are an extension of the charity and an extension of our network. And it will be either people inputting their knowledge pro bono, such as engineers or environmental design specialists, or it will be people inputting directly financially towards the build cost. And finally, there's us, CAUKIN Studio, as a facilitator, making sure that all of these stakeholders have their say, that they're all involved, and us sort of making sure that we can create a design that satisfies all the different needs, the challenges that we'll soon talk about. So that kind of leads us on to the project selection and objectives. We aim to always have a project that is fully backed by the local community and the end users. So the best way for us to do that is to go through that local NGO, and that's one of the main reasons why they're so crucial and so important to a project. And then through that process, we'll work to identify what those project objectives are. For us to be involved, we have to know that we can add value to a project. So if there's a project that can go ahead that would be more beneficial for the locals to carry out themselves, then we'll happily say that, and realize that it's not a project for us. The projects that we're really interested in are the ones which have specific design challenges or hurdles, such as cyclone resistance and wind loading, which we'll talk about in the South Pacific, climatic issues, humidity, all of these things which we can help tackle through our network of designers, our own experience, and use this kind of resource we have in the UK and around the world to make sure these projects are long lasting. So this kind of boils down to three key objectives. It has to be a community-wide social impact, so a project which can impact a wide variety of people. It's not for an individual or one specific family. This is something which can improve day-to-day living, so healthcare, education, community facilities, that kind of thing. Then there's the long-term economic impact. So is this building going to provide an income, a sustainable income for the local community, in which case they can start developing their own facilities in the future without the need for aid. And also how does this project impact the local economy in the surrounding area? What funds are being brought in? What skills are being brought in? Are there new job opportunities being created? And all of that side of things. And finally, making sure that our projects have a low or positive environmental impact. So that covers both the materials that we're using, making sure that it's super locally sourced, that we're keeping transport down to an absolute minimum, making sure that we're using materials that are either recycled, reclaimed, or repurposed, or materials which are natural and renewable as well. So we use a lot of timber you'll see in our buildings, and I guess some of that comes into education of the local community. There's often a bias towards concrete and steel as being the sort of this new, stronger, better material, but actually in a lot of the situations we're building, such as the South Pacific, it makes a lot more sense to build with timber, and it can actually be a lot more versatile, a lot stronger against cyclones and against winds. And if it's used correctly and treated correctly, it can last 30, 40, 50, 60 years. So it's all about just kind of bringing back to the basics in some regard. So that kind of leads on to this was our first kind of big step up. So we've done the playground in Cambodia. We've done 2 more playgrounds the following year in Indonesia. And we were really looking to challenge ourselves and push ourselves a little bit further. We just graduated our undergrad at this point, so we were going into 4th year, and we'd reached out to a charity in the South Pacific. This was kind of the first time we'd really heard about some of the cyclones happening in the South Pacific. One of our team members, Harry, who had been out to Fiji the previous year, so he was a lot more clued in than me and Josh in terms of the recent cyclones they'd had. So in 2016, they had Cyclone Winston. which caused like huge destruction right across the islands. You know, billions of pounds worth of damage, multiple lives lost, and it was kind of, it was, I guess, you know, there was infinite number of projects that needed to happen, and so it kind of became a real hotspot for us to develop our skills and repeatedly go back, revisit our projects, making sure that we're increasing our impact and learning from it. So previously, they were kind of one-off projects, whereas this was the first of, I guess, a series that is ongoing, and increasingly we're putting a focus on that. So these first two projects, one was a kindergarten and one was a community hall. And it was the first time we'd really worked very closely with engineers, going right through the sort of basic principles of how could we get the most efficiency out of the timber, what was going to be, you know, quick solutions where we could use the same skill level that the locals already knew, the same materials that they have available, but make this way stronger and, you know, longer lasting, and try and break that cycle of destruction and rebuild that they were facing year after year on these cyclones.
So I suppose in relation to that, one of the, or these are some of the kind of design considerations we have to tackle with all of our buildings, really, and environmental design and locality materials comes into that a lot. But I suppose our main challenge is trying to weigh up and balance each of these different considerations to come up with a building that, you know, is fit for purpose, is built by and for the community, fits the budget and the time frame, but then also can add value and can overcome maybe some of these kind of weather systems and natural disasters. So the first of which is budget. I mean, it's a pretty obvious one often, especially when we're working with NGOs. It's very much a red line budget. It's not a kind of unlimited funding pot that we can keep going to the client and asking for more money. So what that means when we're designing is that we're counting every single element, every piece of timber, every nail, every screw, to make sure that when we get on site, we're not going to go over budget. But it also means that we're really considering all of the aspects and elements of the design to see which bits are really fundamental and which bits, you know, might be too extravagant or not necessary, to make it as efficient as possible. We've then got climate, as Harry said. You know, South Pacific, we're dealing with severe cyclones, and then also sometimes tidal surges that come as a result of that. So things like raising buildings off the ground in low altitude areas for the tidal surges. Things like making sure that all the connections are really robust, cyclone strapping, rooting it to the ground through correct use of foundations and using the mass of the building and the weight of the foundations to kind of keep it tied down. But then we've also got other climatic issues like really high humidity and moisture. We talk about, there's another slide later on, we can talk about that in more detail. But using kind of natural design methods and kind of environmental design methods to overcome this without having to implement things like air conditioning or, you know, machinery and add-ons and bolt-ons that aren't necessarily accessible. We then got material, so making sure that all of the materials we're using are completely available locally and will continue to be available locally once we've finished the project. That's really important, both for an environmental reason, because, you know, the transport costs and the sourcing costs of that material are then kept down. But also it means that once we've left, the community can then still use those same materials in the future, in their future buildings. So they can hopefully replicate some of the kind of designs that we've come up with and the materials we've used in their future buildings. We've then got skill level. So again, trying to design buildings that maybe have repetitive elements in them, like portal frames, which you'll see in a lot of our kind of South Pacific buildings. The reason for that is that once we've got a team on site that have learned how to build one portal frame, it's really easy for then everyone to kind of copy that, and suddenly, after taking maybe a day to learn how to build one, you can then build another 5 in a single day because everyone's kind of got the hang of it. And it doesn't necessarily need really specialist trade skills or really highly trained carpenters or joiners or whatever it might be to complete the build. And again, that helps with future replicability that's even worse once we've left. And then that's quite intrinsically linked with time. So because often we're working over quite a short time period, I think to date, all of our buildings have been completed somewhere between 2 weeks and 3.5, 4 months. So, you know, we're really looking at quite a tight time schedule and turnaround. That's partly because the international participants that are coming to work on our projects can only do so for a certain period of time. But it also means that, you know, when we're designing, we have to consider how many kind of construction processes can happen on site at one time. So maybe considering prefabricating elements of a building, like those portal frames or like building trusses on one part of the site, whilst foundations are being dug and laid on another part of the site. And then that means that usually around the kind of halfway point of a build project, it kind of all comes together and suddenly you've got a building shell and structure almost out of nowhere. And that's usually a really fun part of the project, and everyone kind of sees where all the hard work that it feels like has been for nothing comes together, and it kind of becomes a building suddenly. There's then information. Often we're designing, you know, for really remote locations and places where it isn't possible to get a surveyor out there, and we're designing from things such as, you know, just Google Maps, Google Earth, even just photographs that we've been sent by the NGO or local community. And that means we need to be quite flexible with the way we design. Obviously, you know, if we turn up on site and there's a site condition that's different to the information that we've been supplied with or had kind of predicted, then our design needs to be able to adapt to that. And, you know, you wouldn't believe the amount of times we've turned up on a site and actually there's like a 3-meter hill or a massive drop that no one told us about, and it's right next to the edge of the site, and that has to be accounted for. But it's usually not a problem because you know, we kind of deliberately try to design in that flexibility. And then finally, access. This one's becoming more and more relevant as we start to work in more and more remote locations. So considering design elements that might need to be shipped to or driven to or even carried to site. So this example here is the Boula Boutique project, where the only access to the island and to the site was through a really small gap in the reef. So all materials had to be taken onto the island through a small fiberglass boat that you can see kind of on the left half of that photo. So it came from the ship, which came from the mainland, onto that fiberglass boat, and then through the reef and onto the site. So that means we've got to select design elements that are, you know, that fit to the scale of that boat. So we can't really specify any really long beams or heavy bits of sections of timber, or, you know, massive amounts of cement and heavy things that might weigh a boat down. So all of these have to be balanced and considered, you know, when it comes to providing or coming up with an efficient design. So we're going to kind of talk through a few of our projects and can touch on especially some of the kind of environmental design aspects and elements of each of them. So this one in particular was a really interesting brief that came to us. I think it was about 3 years ago now. We met a charity called the Tambok Project. Again, so that they operate mainly in Vanuatu, and I think it was 2015 Cyclone Pam. Mm-hmm. Cyclone Pam had struck the islands of Vanuatu and caused, you know, a massive amount of damage across all of the islands. And the Tambok Project had basically gone around all of the islands and evaluated what the damage was and where the need for various projects were. And one of the ones that stood out to them in their research was this village here, Ramwas. So all of their school buildings had been completely destroyed in the cyclone, and they had managed to build back one shelter, but it was still to quite a low standard. They were being taught in kind of tarpaulin tents and really not adequate learning spaces. But another important and interesting element to the brief that Tambok Project brought to us was that because of the position that Ramwas was sited on the mountain in terms of its elevation, they had really high humidity and moisture levels kind of all year round. And that meant that in their old classroom before it was wiped out by the cyclone, their blackboards would often be covered in moisture and condensation. Their learning materials that previously the Tambok Project had been supplying to the school like books, workbooks, dictionaries, that sort of thing, were becoming sodden with moisture in this condensation, and therefore were lasting for half the time that you didn't normally expect them to. So it meant that the Handbook project were constantly sending out these learning resources, and so they came to us and said, like, look, we need to design a building that will not only withstand future hurricanes and cyclones, but that can also somehow control this moisture issue that we've got. So we worked with environmental design specialists at Cardiff University to look at ways we could use completely local and natural resources, things like stack ventilation, and kind of to try and control the humidity and moisture in the space. So the solution that we came up with was basically to paint the roof sheets that surround the kind of library space that you can see here in this photo with black paint, so that the sun would the roof sheets rather would absorb the heat from the sun, raise the temperature in that room, and then therefore lower the relative humidity. When that was coupled with lots of stack ventilation through openings at the top and bottom of the space that can be controlled, the moisture was then whipped away, and the humidity was lowered because of that. That again, coupled with things like designing the bookshelf so that the books were spaced out more than maybe they would be on a typical bookshelf, even using things like end grain timber. So one of the, you can't see it in either of these photos, but one of the internal walls that went through to the library was made from kind of stacked end grain timber. And the idea was that the end grain timber kind of acts as a bit of a sponge and soaks in some of that moisture, so further removes more of the moisture from the atmosphere. And so since completing this project, we've had kind of electronic equipment in there that's been measuring the relative humidity, temperature, all sorts of factors within the space, and it's been showing a 20% lower relative humidity than the other existing classroom on the site. So that's really great to hear. But another kind of wake-up call for the, I suppose, the importance of designing, trying to add as much value to design through structure and these environmental methods, was that it was April 2020? Yeah, April 2020, Vanuatu was hit by another Category 5 cyclone. So I don't know if anyone's familiar with the cyclone scale, but it ranges from 1 to 5. Debatable if it should be 6, but at the moment it ranges from 1 to 5, 1 being a kind of low scale cyclone, and 5 being the most destructive of all storms. And previously it was said that a Category 5 cyclone is the kind of thing that would only occur sort of once in a lifetime, every sort of 50 to 80 years. But this is now becoming a very frequent occurrence. As I said, we've had 2. We had 2 in 2020 hit the South Pacific, and unfortunately a cyclone did hit Vanuatu, as I say, in April 2020, and the eye of the storm actually went straight through the island and this village. And obviously it was quite a nervous time for us. We were very concerned about all of the community members and that everyone would be safe and well, and of course that the building would hopefully stand up to the storm. But we heard after some, I think it was probably about a couple of weeks of nervous waiting until communications had been repaired, that the school had managed to survive the cyclone completely unscathed, and had actually been used as a shelter during the storm, and was also then being used after the storm had left for kind of temporary refuge for the people whose houses had been completely destroyed. So I think that really highlighted the importance to us of making sure that we can add as much value to the designs of these spaces as possible.
So again, leading on from the kind of the role of South Pacific projects, we've got the Nanu Community Hall. This project had a bit of a focus around the performance side of things in Fijian culture. So within a typical Fijian village, they will often have a meke, which is a traditional Fijian dance. Nandi village is very well known for their dance, as well as their choir. And so part of that design brief was to integrate a sort of performance stage and a performance element to the project. They often have people from surrounding resorts or international visitors come and watch them perform. and it was currently they were doing it on the village green, but actually it made sense to use this space not only as a typical village hall would be used with weddings, funerals, events, all that kind of thing, but actually to have it as a kind of a hub for increasing the performance elements. And this was kind of coupled with the local women's group that would sell their handicrafts and make their handicrafts. Currently, they've been sort of selling them from their doorsteps for, again, these same groups that would come through the village from surrounding resorts. And since the construction of the project, they'd seen an increase in their sales by having this sort of dedicated space to do that in. So you can kind of see that where the shape came from. It's kind of this crescendoing shape, creating sort of two stages, one on the outside on the decking for people to sit on the grass and the green when it's nice weather, and then when the weather's not so good, again, you've still got that kind of crescendoing shape from the inside. This project was completed in 2018, and we've since been back to visit it twice or once. And we quickly learned that they'd integrated a kindergarten class 2 days a week. And it was great for us to see the kind of duality of the change of use, as well as, how our local community adapts to their changing needs. So because of the success of this kindergarten that they'd integrated, the government had then got involved, contacted the village and asked them to increase it to 5 days a week and increase the scope of it as well, so that it was taking older students of like primary school age. And as part of that initiative, they would then educate and train up a local teacher to run that school full time. So that's really, interesting for us to see, and great for us to see the kind of flexibility of these buildings, and the importance of making sure they are flexible. And in 15 years' time, maybe it'll be used for something completely different. So something quite important.
I think also worth highlighting that in quite a lot of Fijian villages, there's usually a registered building that is registered for a kind of cyclone evacuation centre, and often that is the community hall. Now, Nindi are lucky enough that they have quite a big church, which is also fairly well-built building. But part of the brief for this one, again, was also to become a registered kind of evacuation centre. So it was really important that we got the structural right on this one. We worked with Centre Space design engineers to come up with this design where you've got this kind of structural exoskeleton that is what holds the building together and really roots it down to the ground. And then you've got that kind of inner layer that kind of envelopes the building, but is tied back to that structure so that it's really not going anywhere and it's really solid. And again, the second cyclone that hit the South Pacific was in December, just gone in 2020. And this building was used as well for a kind of evacuation centre, and thankfully again survived unscathed. So again, further highlighting that kind of importance of adding value through structural design and using those local materials in kind of innovative ways, I suppose. So this one was our largest build to date. It was in Zambia, Evergreen School. So we were
nothing to do with cyclones, this one.
No, this one's not to do with cyclones, but
we thought we'd leave a few in just for variety.
Yeah. So this was kind of a charity that is run by a professor from Cardiff University called Mothers of Africa. The charity's called Mothers of Africa. The professor's called Judith Hall. But they approached us with a school that they'd been working with for some time, kind of delivering educational supplies, Evergreen School. And whilst they'd been doing that, they'd noticed that kind of classroom sizes there were 150 plus per classroom, and it wasn't a very productive learning environment. So they wanted us to design and build a space that would obviously increase the amount of teaching space and try to reduce class sizes down to about 40 pupils per class. So we were tasked with designing and building 4 classrooms and a teacher's office. But this one was a really important project for us because we were trying to kind of push the boundaries as much as we could with trying to change perceptions around gender role models in some of these locations. So often, you might experience prescribed gender roles in places like Zambia, where it's not necessarily commonplace for women to work in construction. So we wanted this project to kind of lead by example, and we set it as our kind of objective to employ a 50-50 split of local team members, so 50% male, 50% female. And we thought that was important because it was a school build as well, that young people within the school could see that actually you don't, these prescribed gender roles don't need to exist and shouldn't exist, and that actually we found that the work ethic of the women that were working on site was actually far better than most of the men on site as well. So it was quite an important project for us in that respect.
This was one of our first, I guess, key projects in the UK. It was working with the Eden Project in Cornwall, which I'm sure many of you will be familiar with. We worked with a charity, a bee conservation charity, to create this kind of sculptural beacon pavilion type structure up on the outskirts of the Eden Project, with the aim to both house a live bee colony. So behind the two big doors that the girl is opening on the side, there's 50,000 live bees living within, which behind a glass screen that the visitors can see and engage with, but also demonstrate some of the research that the charity had been doing and undertaking through information boards and information screens. So the structure's built entirely from reclaimed scaffolding from a nearby supplier. It was actually one of the original suppliers that built the Eden Project, I don't know when it was, 20, 30 years ago. So much of the scaffolding will actually have been used back on the very first construction on that site all those years ago. So again, just looking at using materials that are locally sourced, and even when a client is wanting to use something, metal or a different types of material, it's just a different way of thinking about how do you make that as environmental as possible. Can you use it reclaimed, recycled, upcycled, etc.
So then again, moving back to the kind of South Pacific chain of projects that we've been working on. This one was the Bula Batiki coconut oil processing plant. So again, quite another interesting brief, that it's the community on Batiki Island. So there's 4 villages on Batiki Island, and they all have formed a company called the Bula Batiki Coconut Oil Company, and they essentially produce virgin coconut oil on their island as a collective of villages. But they kind of upscaled their production and got to a point where they were using all of their houses, the community hall, the church, all the available space they had to produce this coconut oil. So that meant that they kind of capped their production, but also that they weren't meeting some of the kind of food hygiene and safety standards that would have allowed them to sell to a kind of wider audience, a more international audience. So they basically needed a dedicated facility to do this. So one that spatially was designed to complement the kind of production process, but also one that would reach those kind of food safety and hygiene standards, so that they could sell to places like Australia, New Zealand, and further afield, and therefore increase their sustainable income and increase the amount of coconut oil that they could produce. So again, trying to create a building which can create that kind of sustainable economic impact.
So yeah, that's kind of wraps up some of the key projects that we've completed over the last 5 years. But another thing that we wanted to touch upon that's kind of crucial to the success of a building, especially in locations where we're constantly revisiting, such as Fiji. So each year when we're going back to complete a new building, we'll make a point of revisiting all of our past projects, checking for how the building has weathered over the time, what materials are, how they're faring, but equally how the project's actually being used, has there been any change of use? Is there any, is it too small, too big? All of these different things. What are people's feelings towards it? So this project was that first project in Fiji that I spoke about early on, the kindergarten. And back in 2017, I think it was, we started this project. There was only eight kindergarten students at the school, and they were getting taught in a little local canteen. So again, no dedicated space, no proper lighting or ventilation or proper classroom. So we built this dedicated school room with 2 toilets, and was to our delight, when we came back a year later, was all up and running and filled with kids, and the attendance had gone from 8 students all the way up to 35 students. So that was, really awesome for us to see. But it kind of highlighted that there was almost even more need for flexibility to be designed in, because they were having to turn away any new prospective pupils. So we went back to the charity we work with in Fiji and discussed the possibility of increasing the size of the kindergarten, and agreed to create a second classroom with to make sure we were utilizing a new teacher that they recently hired, so that they could now run two school groups simultaneously, and increase that number again up to sort of 50 plus students. And whilst we were there the first time around, we kind of noticed that the school was being used by teachers and parents after school as a kind of little hangout spot with some of the kids as well. So we experimented a little bit with different construction techniques and created a little bit of a canopy, you can see on the side as well there. And equally, as important as it is to evaluate each individual project, it's always important to look at the company and the organization as a whole and see how we can improve year on year and widen our impact and widen our, I guess, kind of mission. So looking at how much education is happening on site. So, we've managed to rack up 120,000 hours of on-site education, which for us is, super important. And we're always trying to talk about how the impact of a building can go beyond the actual building itself, and should go beyond the building itself. And every building and every project, there's a way in which it can be used to, widen that kind of impact. So we always try and use ours for educational type projects. But equally, is there ways that you can bring in extra jobs? Is there ways you can challenge gender equality that we mentioned earlier? So all of these different things that a project, if you look at it more holistically, can actually help tackle.
So I suppose COVID, we couldn't get through a lecture without mentioning it, of course. It's kind of brought issues. Obviously, a lot of our projects are based internationally, and with international travel at a complete standstill last year and potentially even this year, it means we've had to kind of reevaluate what we were doing, and if there was a way that we could kind of create impact, in other ways. So I suppose there's three ways we've decided that we might be able to do this. So one of those things is working in the UK, working close to home, something that we've always been looking to do more of, and kind of now really have the opportunity to do that. So it's seeing how architecture or the kind of process of the projects that we've worked on and that kind of community engagement and all of those processes could be used to tackle social or environmental issues close to home, things like mental health, loneliness, homelessness. If there's ways in which built spaces or architecture or design or even art can potentially tackle some of these kind of key issues. So we're looking at working on installations in the UK, with a real focus on making sure that the materials of that project are sustainable, contribute to circular economy, we're not using plastic or any of those sort of materials in anything. A big problem with art installations or those kind of projects is that once the lifespan of the gallery or exhibition or whatever it is has ended and is finished with, it then just gets disposed of. So we've been looking to work with festival festivals and events people who put on kind of pop-up displays or pop-up spaces, especially for festivals that can kind of tackle this issue and try to use materials or design spaces that could then be used elsewhere. So maybe it contributes to a school and becomes a space that's used at a school afterwards, or it's made from materials that are completely natural and can biodegrade entirely. So that's been kind of a really interesting exploration. It's also working on kind of, I suppose, more, you might consider them as commercial projects, but looking how we might be able to thread impact into those projects as well. You know, we don't believe that it's only charitable projects that can create an impact on the community and the end user. We believe that any projects, you know, even if it's a high-rise building block for 500 apartments or whatever it is, can still have an impact, a positive impact on a community or on the environment.
Yeah, another kind of aspect to this new kind of UK project type branch is working with a much younger audience to try and help diversify architecture as a profession. So we all know that architecture is very white, male dominated profession, and we've been thinking about how we can best use our skills and use our techniques to try and diversify that more. And so we've started an initiative to work with schools in underrepresented areas and developing areas around the UK to run smaller, shorter workshops between 1 to 3 weeks to get a much wider group of students engaged with architecture, understanding exactly what it is, how they can get involved, and doing small kind of design and build interventions. So it could be a series of benches for their playground, it could be the playground itself, a bike shelter, whatever it is that the school needs, but running those kids through the whole process so that they can see, this is a career that they could pursue, that they might enjoy, and hopefully further down the line, that would then see its impact.
So another way, with all this kind of time we've got on our hands now that we haven't been able to kind of go to any of our international projects last year, we've been looking at doing competitions, but at ways we can kind of reach out to a wider audience. So collaborating with either other architects or even opening up the kind of competition entries to students. So by using our network that we already have and the kind of portfolio of projects, but then working alongside other students who might not necessarily have a kind of reputation that they can carry with an entry by themselves. We partner up and kind of resource pool and use all of our skills together so that we can create better competition entries and hopefully stand a better chance of winning. Interestingly, this one on the right was for a unique Airbnb competition hosted by Airbnb in Fiji. Well, our idea was that it would be a unique Airbnb in Fiji that was run by and owned by the local community. Unfortunately, because of COVID, the competition ended up getting postponed or got the can, but we're hoping they bring that one back. We think that would be a really great project.
And finally, the virtual workshops that were mentioned at our introduction to the lecture. Like we were saying earlier about increasing our impact, I think one of the important ways for us to do that is through more sort of research-focused projects, and through projects which can be replicated a lot more than kind of the one-off projects we've been working on so far. So this virtual workshop we ran over the summer, we had sort of 45 participants from a number of different universities over the UK and over the world, all working towards this brief for designing a prototype sustainable house in the South Pacific, one that would take into consideration cyclone resistance, wind loading, but equally take into consideration what materials are available, what skills are available, and all of these different, difficult design challenges, with the ultimate goal of creating a kind of guide, handbook, or I guess a system for local communities to build back their own structures and their own houses, but in a way which would kind of break that cycle of destruction and rebuild and destruction and rebuild. So that ended in September, I think, and we've been now in touch with a number of different organizations in Fiji, both some governmental bodies, but equally non-governmental NGOs and charities as well, to see how we can get a project going initially. So building a smaller number of projects in the foreseeable future, seeing how they wear up over the following year, how the families enjoy them, what anything that's wrong with them, how much they cost, all of these different things, so that we can then iron out any issues and roll it out much further afield. And I guess without coronavirus, we maybe wouldn't have had the time to pursue a more research-focused project. So in that sense, it's been a little bit of a silver lining and opened up other opportunities for us to pursue, which is good.
Yeah, so kind of taking a look at those research topics that we've always been interested in, and obviously with so much work in the South Pacific, I think it's been about 8 projects now we've completed, and there's tons more in the pipeline as well that we're working on. It feels that an issue that we know quite well now, and that we feel that we're well positioned to hopefully provide a better and longer lasting solution on. So I suppose with that in mind, our kind of 2021 projects that we're working on, we're kind of going to be producing virtual workshops for each of the projects. So each one's got a different brief, and we'll engage industry professionals, lecturers, academics, and people working in practice that are kind of related to projects in a similar sort of sphere. And then hopefully, if we can get out there and international travel and coronavirus allows, we'll then be building these projects on site. So taking the ideas that have been formed by people that take part in the virtual workshop and translating them through into the final design that will hopefully in 2021 be built.
Yeah, I mean, we believe in collaborative design, and that the more heads you have thinking about an issue, the better. So on that first virtual workshop, we had 40 people all researching different topics. We had some people looking into earth construction in the South Pacific, which is something that has not really been done before at all. People trying to do a lot more research around bamboo and why it's not being used as much anymore in Fiji as it used to be, and it's in the more ancient vernacular architecture, why that is, how it can be treated and used safely and strongly now, with more modern knowledge. And then it's a case of us then collating all of that information, all of the different design ideas people have produced, and then refining it down to something which is buildable, and then hopefully this summer actually translating that right through to the final finished outcome. So for anyone that is involved, that is interested, obviously this is open to people to sign up to right now. And obviously we believe it's best to do both. I mean, to see it right from the brief stage all the way through to the finished built thing is, it's a really great experience.
So I suppose that concludes our kind of presentation. If anyone, a bit of a shameless plug, if anyone wants to follow us on Instagram, it's at CAUKIN Studio. Does anyone have any questions?
Thank you very much, CAUKIN, for such a great lecture. It was a fantastic insight into the breadth of projects you undertake in your process. So if anyone does have any questions, could you type them into the chat bar? And would you guys mind if we keep the questions going until 7:15?
Yeah, cool.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
While everybody's thinking, I'll start off by asking the first question. How do you think your experiences working abroad will impact your work in the UK and vice versa when you return to working abroad?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think we feel that although some of we've worked in remote communities that might be hard to access, I think that's actually very translatable to work in the UK and working with either underrepresented groups or, again, like I said, groups that are hard to access. So maybe that's a person who's homeless and working with them to come up with a solution around some sort of kind of built accommodation, and using those kind of community engagement techniques that we've used on our international projects, but to engage communities, close to home. And a community doesn't just have to be, for example, a village in Fiji or a local village down the road. A community could be something quite a bit wider than that. For instance, you guys are a community of people that care about environmental and sustainable design at Sheffield. So it's taking those techniques and applying them to situations here in the UK.
I think it's just generally that idea that everybody should be allowed to change the spaces that they inhabit. I mean, even in the UK, it's very rare to have the resource or the tools to shape where you're living on, and unless especially in the UK, architecture is kind of seen as something that's very much a luxury or is expensive that only the few can afford. So we're trying to demonstrate how that's not the case, and it shouldn't be the case, and that you can create very much affordable spaces or projects for the masses and use the skills for that.
Thanks, that's great.
We've got a question from Anne in the chat. It says, could you talk a little bit more about financing your NGO projects? What's the model and how do you pay yourselves?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's definitely evolved over time. Like we said, the first one we kind of funded entirely ourselves through a Kickstarter campaign, which was the only option at the time. Back then it was a case of trying to convince an NGO or charity that they should give us the time of day to hopefully build them a project with no portfolio or previous experience. It took a bit of trying, but obviously at that time we were saying, look, there's no risk on your part. All you need to do is give us a plot of land and help us to work with you, and we'll fund it, we'll design it, and we'll build it. Obviously that's quite an unsustainable way. We asked our aunts and uncles and grandparents and all of our friends to help us fund that, and that's not something that we could keep doing. So now it's kind of, with this kind of experience we've built up and the portfolio projects, it's a lot easier to make new contacts with new NGOs and to get people to see what it is that we're doing. But we've moved away from putting time into funding the projects entirely ourselves, because obviously we're managing the whole design, construction, project management process, and that's a lot of work in itself. So that responsibility shifted almost entirely towards the NGO. So using their kind of networking contacts and fundraising contacts to fund those projects. And part of the budget for that project goes towards our kind of design and construction fee. But because of the kind of construction workshop fees that we're also getting, which help to cover some of our operating costs, we don't have to charge an equivalent professional fee to the NGO. So it kind of helps to add more of the budget towards materials and that sort of thing. And I think it's only through the kind of experience we've built up and the portfolio of projects now that we are able to do that, and to convince, I suppose, larger NGOs that do have more funding to put towards these kind of projects that we can deliver what we're going to, saying we can deliver.
Thanks. Our next question is from Ruth. When you first started working abroad on these build projects, you were quite young, like our age. What were some of the biggest things you had to learn about the process, or misconceptions you had?
The immediate one that comes to mind is physical construction. It's not really something that is taught at architecture school at all, and it's none of us had that much experience. We'd done a bit of DIY stuff here and there, and we built the odd shed, but it was nothing like an entire playground. So that was something that we had to very much learn on the job, and that kind of highlighted the crucial collaboration that's needed of getting those locals involved who have built their own homes, they've built their own buildings. So it's that we can seeing that skill exchange of making something more interesting through design expertise, and then therefore learning from their own construction techniques. So that's kind of the most obvious ones.
Yeah, I think every project, even still now, hopefully you guys think we're still young. I think I'm still young anyway. You know, we're still learning. Every single project we do it is a massive learning process, and I think it's not being afraid to make mistakes, because obviously you will, but it's making sure that you never make the same one twice and that you can learn from that whole process. But I think that in a way, that kind of inexperience and naivety when we were architecture students and doing that first project also meant that we put 5 times the amount of time into kind of researching and trying to get to know as much as we could about all the various different scenarios or eventualities that might play out when we're on site or whilst we're working with the community. So yeah, trying to research as much about local design methods, local materials, try to get as much information from the community and the NGO as possible so that we kind of could plan for every eventuality. I think that kind of spurred us on to do more of that.
Cool. Kind of linked to that. So as an action group, our mission is for sustainability to be embedded within architectural education. As you guys are so young, you were only at uni recently. Do you have any thoughts about like how sustainability can be more embedded within architecture school, or do you think it's sufficiently addressed?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. I think, again, linking to that as well, it follows on to, you know, social architecture and humanitarian architecture in curriculums as well, which is, you know, both of those things are something we really care about. I think we found that actually our tutors at university were very open to us saying to them, look, we want to learn more about this, and kind of, I suppose, pressing them to, you know, concentrate more on these important issues and topics. And I think there's definitely a growing awareness now as well that actually young people, this is what we care about, and this is going to be the future of architecture. So I think we took our education as a chance to explore those things and kind of put those agendas on our own explorations and projects. I mean, even if we were, you know, you might be presented by a university brief that doesn't necessarily scream social architecture or sustainable design, I think there's a way that any building can be social or sustainable. So it's kind of pushing your own agenda in that respect as well.
Yeah, it's a difficult one. I think, you know, in general, REBA is very difficult to infiltrate and change their agendas. I know that there are definitely a few action groups and a few people that we've spoken to that are more on the inside than we are. I mean, we're not very closely linked with REBA at all. And there definitely is movement, but I think it's just very slow. And for something to actually filter down into the curriculum takes just, you know, such a long time. That's part of the reason we run our workshops, and part of the reason we're doing the virtual stuff is because we know that it is something that a lot of students want to do and want to learn how to. And, you know, we just kind of learn on the job, and it's, you know, it's not the best way to do it, and it shouldn't be the way to do it. So as frustrating as it is, I guess that's why we are doing these projects, and that it's not something that's just already integrated into the curriculum. But, you know, give it 5-10 years, maybe it will be.
Thanks for that. We've got another question from Peter. Do you have any tips to first-year architecture students just starting out interested in community design?
I guess, yeah, linked to everything that we've just said is also understanding that you're not going to know everything before you take on a project, and there's no way you'll have all of that information to cover all corners. You know, we're definitely advocates for kind of jumping in the deep end, and if you're passionate about something and you have a project in mind, or community or a local group in your hometown that you know could benefit from a small little project, it's about, I guess, identifying those projects and identifying what your skills are and seeing where the gaps are, and reaching out to your tutors, reaching out to people that are more experienced. You know, if anyone's got any questions to us, we're happy for people to contact us or email us, and team up as well. You know, find other people in your year group that are equally passionate about the same kind of things. And there's power in numbers. So our kind of advice would be just to kind of go for it.
Definitely.
Because otherwise kind of years tick by and people are very resistant to just doing it. There's always kind of like, oh, I need a bit more experience, and then it never happens.
That's some really great advice. Thanks for that. We've got another question from Jim Marco about vernacular technology. So when it comes to using vernacular technology and designing for flexibility, research is key as there's a shortage of official guidelines. So what's your main strategy to go about it before starting your research-based workshops? Do you have a practical approach for sustainability and flexibility, and how do you look for those skills when hiring? So just looking at that kind of vernacular and local skills, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, especially with kind of guidelines, official guidelines, and even like local planning regulations or that sort of thing, always quite thin on the ground. It's working to, I suppose, a hybrid of design standards in that respect. So making sure that we meet the local design guidelines and standards, but then also push them and go beyond them. So for design in the South Pacific, for example, it's making sure we're meeting all those local standards and planning regulations, but then also taking from New Zealand and Australian standards and that are slightly higher or stricter, and implementing those standards on our projects as well, so that we can kind of push the boundaries of what a local kind of where the local planning laws or design standards lack.
Yeah, in terms of research, again, like desktop research is often pretty far and few between and quite thin in terms of some of the specific issues we're looking for or specific locations we're working in, which is why it's so important for us to collaborate with an NGO that has a lot of experience of being on the ground, because that kind of tacit knowledge that the community has and the knowledge that they've built up over the years of working there is just super invaluable. And now that we've been working in Fiji for a number of years, that's something that we've been able to gain over time from living in the villages, looking at how people live, how people work, how the buildings are built. And that's all information that can't really be found online in a textbook. So when we're first working in a brand new location, that kind of local link is super important, and we do rely quite heavily on that.
Thanks. And we've got another question from Anupama. What were your challenges in participatory design given the unfamiliarity with materials like timber in some regions? How did you go about the construction details with them?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose in terms of unfamiliarity of materials, because we're trying, in every project, we're selecting materials that are completely locally available, and we study the local vernacular, as much as we can. We haven't really come up against that problem too much. I suppose it's when we're taking those materials and then maybe using them in slightly different ways, or ways that might seem slightly more confusing. But it's making sure that during that whole design process, it's fully understood by all of the kind of stakeholders, including the local community. So using things like sharing of SketchUp models and doing kind of video walkthroughs and that sort of thing to show those techniques. And then when we're on site, if there's still anything that's not understood in terms of the construction detail, it's making a really quick mock-up of it on site, or doing a really rough sketch of it, and that's the best way to gain understanding. I mean, obviously it's a lot easier to do when you're stood in front of someone compared to when you're trying to do it virtually. But I think when we do this sort of stuff virtually and share our designs and go through that iterative process with communities that are obviously remote to us, it's using those tools like SketchUp and kind of 3D visualization that really comes into play.
Yeah, and once we're on the ground, it's much easier as well. Like once we've built one portal frame or one junction, people pick it up like that, and it's just a case of repeating it, 10, 20 times. So yeah, I think that was the other. I didn't touch on it that much, but
one of the other things and reasons for designing flexibility into our buildings before we've kind of got there on site is that once we have got there on site, we can evaluate exactly what materials are available in local hardware stores or even available as natural local resources that we couldn't find either online through our research or via our kind of community and NGO partners. It might be that we're actually quite surprised by them having availability of a certain material, and actually we can use that in this building now because we know it's available. So that is also quite key to kind of keeping that flexibility of the design.
Nice. Kind of linked to that, you mentioning kind of the disruptions due to virtual teaching. We've got a question from Emily that says, how did you deal with the projects that couldn't go ahead and be built this summer due to COVID travel restrictions? Have you adapted the designs to make it a complete self-build project by the communities you're involved with, or has the build been pushed back?
Yeah, it's a great question. For now, so there was 6 builds that were due to take place in 2020. For now, they've all been pushed back. We are exploring with a number of them ways that they can take place without us being there, or at least without a full team being there. Maybe there's 1 or 2 project managers on the ground that can help keep things ticking along. But I think part of the issue with that is also that often most of the funding for most of the buildings is reliant on us being able, the whole team being able to get there. So that is one issue. But we're also very aware that the longer these projects are pushed back, or the more they're pushed back, the more time that is for the communities to not have the classroom or whatever the project is that we're going out there to build. So yeah, one of the things we are looking to do is working with basically local contractors and also local universities or local schools to rope in kind of younger, maybe more unskilled members of communities to build the projects.
Yeah, linking onto this, we've got a question asking, are there possibilities of creating core partner architecture groups that are locals in countries you work in, which, when supported, can carry out similar projects? Or perhaps do these already exist, just in relation to things on hold due to COVID, while you're not on site, and also issues due to travelling?
Yeah, that's a good question. It was something were going to hope. Well, I mean, it was going to be this year, but obviously COVID's pushed our timescale back. But in kind of growing our organisation, part of that was going to be that we were going to open a number of local offices in some of the regions. So a South Pacific one in Zambia, and potentially even one in South America, so that kind of local teams, local project teams can work almost autonomously, and therefore we can kind of get around issues of kind of stops on global travel. Obviously, in the initial stage, that takes some of our team being there to set that up and get that going. So that hasn't been able to happen so far, but it's definitely on the radar and something that we're hope to resume as soon as possible. But I think in addition to that, there's also communities with in a lot of these locations already. So Architecture in Development, which is a website which is basically a resource pool for people that want to or are currently working on these projects in regions all over the world. So that's quite a good resource to look at and go to if there might be a project there that you might want to collaborate on that you feel you can help with as well. So it's much more localized.
Awesome, that's really exciting. Kind of linked to that idea of being international, Alexa's got a question. She asks, where do you feel the future of international aid is heading, specifically in terms of combating wastage and dependency? And how do you prevent white saviorism within your company and projects?
Yeah, another good question. I mean, we definitely see charity work as being often a little bit outdated in some of the ways in which it's typically run. I mean, we're not strictly a charity ourselves and don't have too much intention of becoming a charity, at least not for this kind of international work. We see it much more as a typical collaboration with with an end client, which might be a charity or a community or a figurehead, whoever that might be. And
yeah, I think it's about making sure that the projects and kind of things we're working on are coming from the community and are driven by the communities themselves. You know, I think a lot of charity is seen as like aid and finance coming from overseas to help out a community, but actually the charities that are the most successful and can create the most impact are the ones that kind of supplement and push forward these kind of development projects. So, I mean, an example of that is looking at ways that you know, we can finance these projects differently. So rather than having just international donors giving to one-off projects, maybe it's coming up with financing or mortgaging schemes for communities we're working with, so that, for example, the Buddha Batiki project, loans can come from the government, and then the community themselves pay it back over time. And obviously, once they've paid off their debt, they're then creating further income, and that's, you know, that's a much more sustainable model, because it's not just, okay, you know, a lump sum of one-off money or aid coming from somewhere. It's a much more longer-term development plan. I think that's the way we think that international development should go and is kind of heading. And then I suppose the white saviorism thing is a question that kind of comes up occasionally as well. You know, obviously we can't get past the fact that we are white people going to these places to work on these kind of projects, but it's that thing we talk about adding value and making sure that if it's not a project that we can bring any sort of value to, then it's not a project that we should be involved in. So it's using our kind of resource and access to the opportunities that we've had and the network that we have to add value to these projects. You know, it's not a case of, you know, using it for our own benefit. It's making sure that the community is the ones that have requested the project and the ones that are involved throughout the entire process.
Yeah, I think it comes down to that project selection and making sure it's done for the right reasons, and we're not taking on projects for the sake of taking on a project just so that we can say that we've done something. And that again comes down to collaborating with the right people, making sure we have that right connection on the ground.
Thanks. And for our final question, will be ICEs. You mentioned that you conduct POE surveys. Do they alter the use of buildings in a more sustainable way, and how do they contribute to your subsequent projects?
Yes, yeah, definitely. I mean, I think, hopefully you can see through the years of the projects we've done in Fiji that the kind of evolution they've been on in terms of, you know, using the materials in a much more sustainable way. So the first build, the Ngo kindergarten, it was a very timber heavy project, and that was partly because of you know, it being our first build there, and we needed to make sure you know, that it definitely stood the test of time and stood up to future cyclones. But as we've kind of gained more knowledge of working there, created more partnerships and understood the kind of climate and structural implications and material availability there, we've been able to make the projects more efficient and work better, provide more space for the same kind of quantity of materials and same kind of cost over time. But then also seeing how buildings are being used, and actually maybe there's kind of unexpected uses, like Harry said with the 90 community hall. It wasn't just being used for the kind of typical community hall functions, it actually then became a school and that sort of thing. So it's making sure that we can factor or try as best we can to kind of factor in those potential changes that we never saw, but obviously understood from post-evaluation surveys. If there's anything to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it would have been also impossible for us to run the virtual design workshop around prototype housing had we not done those evaluations and been there a number of years. And I think it's only kind of after you've done that quite a substantial bulk of work, that you can start tackling bigger issues and start rolling out impact in wider areas. So because we've now lived in a whole variety of different village homes, and seen directly how people live and use their spaces, how people cook there, and how that's different from village to village, it means that what we're creating isn't some totally abstract idea or something that's just added on or pushed on, but we can kind of understand what the needs are and the kind of flexibility. So it has to be a design or a much broader guideline that can be adapted per family. Each family can decide, how big they want it, where they want the kitchen, what kind of kitchen they want it to be, all these different things. And that's going to be something which is much more useful and successful than just like one set design, be all fits all kind of solution. So all of that comes down to having done these surveys.
Awesome. Well, I think we'll wrap it up here. This has been such a great lecture, and some really interesting questions have come out of it. So thank you guys so much. I'm sure we'd normally have some applause here, but on behalf of the Climate Action Group and the rest of the audience, we just want to say thank you for coming and talking to us, and taking your time to speak to us. Thank you to everyone else who attended today as well. Please follow us on social media and get in touch if you want to be involved with what we're doing, and keep an eye out for our upcoming podcasts that should be coming up.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, cheers for
You have been watching an open lecture hosted by Students for Climate Action from Sheffield School of Architecture. Catch up with us on our website at ssoaclimateaction.com to see what we're up to, for other content and resources, and for links to our social media channels. Thanks for tuning in.